Now listen up.
Coming to you from a toddler's playroom in the Lone Star State. Welcome to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History, where we ramble and you listen. Bringing you weird history, food science, and the facts you didn't know you needed. Here are your hosts, Bob and Tom.
Hi, historians. I'm Bob.
And I'm Tom.
Welcome to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History. Our podcasts are intended to be lighthearted, mostly family-friendly, but some language or content may not be suitable for young listeners. The food, health, and beauty industry is worth trillions of dollars in the United States. Its supply chain is safer and more efficient than it's ever been in history. However, sometimes shit happens, and history is made. Since this is our first episode, we'll give you a little bit of history about ourselves and this podcast. We're going to call you, the listener, historians, as we discuss food, science, history, greed, health, or whatever else comes to our minds. So, I'm Bob, and I have a master's degree in food science and microbiology toxicology. I spent 25 years in the U.S. Army conducting process assessments and risk analysis on food production facilities all over the world. When I retired, I worked for the Food and Drug Administration as a consumer safety officer, training officer, which means really I just kind of traveled and taught classes. Then I went to work for a defense agency as a research and development program manager for a wide range of different technologies. I've been married for 34 years, and I have 3 children who are all married and in their 30s. I have 6 grandchildren. So a little bit about this podcast. My kids, I like to say that I ramble on a lot about science and history. So my daughter, Jenna, thought it would be a good idea to start this podcast to give me and her husband an outlet. She recruited her husband, Tom, as my co-host to handle all of the technology. She says I'm the content creator and he is the tech guru. So, Tom?
Hey, historians. I'm Tom. I don't have any fancy degrees like Bob yet, but I'm slowly working on them. I'd like to think I'm a reasonably smart guy, though. I joined the Army at 19 and served for 11 total years. 8 on active duty and 3 in the Texas Army National Guard. I've even managed to stay around the military as a Department of the Army civilian employee. So far, my whole career has been with communications. Everything from desktop to support, to radios, to network infrastructure, to big-time SATCOM systems and transmission terminals. I've been fortunate enough to travel the world and have some pretty cool life experiences that you guys will surely get to hear about in some of our episodes. I've been married to my beautiful wife Jenna for 11 years, and we have an almost 2-year-old daughter. If any of you historians have requests for topics that you want to hear about, just head over to healthwealthandhistory.com and let us know. We'll post some notes of what we cover each time, as well as a few references that we used in case you want to learn more. Today's episode is titled The Real Pork in the Defense Act. And we'll start you guys off with a quick quote from author unknown. The next best thing to eating food is talking about it. All right, historians, let's get started with a quick little introduction to some of the things that we're going to talk about during this episode. Go ahead, Bob.
So just to lay the groundwork, we'll talk a little bit about the current pandemic, modern hunting and gathering techniques. Then we'll talk about the Defense Production Acts, the 4 major players in the pork industry, and then we'll end up with how we can make the industry and the world a little bit more green, Bob and Tom's way.
Heading into our episode, let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the timeline of events through April of this year. This is going to help set the stage for discussing how this pandemic affected the food industry. Let's start off with the latest statistics as of the time we're recording this episode. In the world, we're looking at 33,689,355 confirmed positive cases, with 1,008,618 confirmed deaths. In the U.S., we're at 7,367,177 cases, with 210,140 confirmed deaths. And in our home state of Texas, we're at 777,165 confirmed cases, with 15,923 confirmed deaths.
Did you know that 100 million viral particles could fit on the head of a pin? That's pretty crazy and amazing. And that 10% of our genome is actually made up of viruses. Pretty amazing organisms. Now, It started in Wuhan, China. It's a city of 11 million people. It's huge when you think about it. Cases of a SARS-like disease started being talked about locally around November 2019. These are dates we kind of need to really think about here. And then coronaviruses started officially being talked about 31st December 2019, reported by Wuhan Municipal Health Commission as several cases of pneumonia. It took them a while to actually get that out to the rest of the world. During that time, you have a tremendous amount of business still going out and people flying all over the world.
Yeah, it took China quite a bit of time to really officially talk about the fact that there was a viral outbreak happening. And really, it wasn't until January that this started becoming really mainstream.
Wow.
And actually, on January 11th is when the first officially reported death in China happened. And right after that, about a week later, that's when the CDC started recommending that the airports conduct screenings in the U.S. About a week after that, we're seeing the first reported case of this new coronavirus in the U.S. And it's just kind of starts snowballing from there in the month of January. I think it was towards the end of the month, something around the 29th or so. That's about when we started repatriating U.S. citizens from China back to the U.S. I think you guys probably saw it on the news with those chartered flights. That was kind of a big deal that they were talking about. And then on the 31st of January is when the U.S. officially declared a public health emergency. Then we roll into the month of February. We have on the 8th of February is the first official U.S. death. On the 21st is when the CDC says that a pandemic is likely. On the 26th of February, the CDC declares that it is spreading within U.S. communities. And then on the 29th of February, leap year, the FDA, that's when they actually started opening up testing across the United States.
Okay, so then we roll into March. And around the 2nd of March, people start panic buying. They can run out and they buy up all the toilet paper, cleaning products, canned goods, bottled water, etc. The toilet paper thing and paper towels was pretty crazy. I don't know what that's all about. And then about a week later, the U.S. declares travel ban to Europe, and that's 11 March. And remember, that was really hit the news. And then 13 March, Trump declares national emergency. And then on the 16th of March, the lockdown starts to flatten the curve out. Trump invokes the Defense Production Act on the 17th of March. Now, this all happened, look, from the 2nd of March to the 17th of March. That's a wartime authority that allows him to direct industry to produce critical equipment and goods. Now, a few days following that, the U.S. surpasses 10,000 cases. All right, so we just go back a month, 8th of February, you get the first death, right? And then, well, it's just a little over a month that the U.S. surpasses 10,000 cases. So 27 March, Trump signs a $2 trillion stimulus because we have so many people that are out of work. And then we get into April. Distribution starts becoming impacted. Food service supply chains were dumping milk because of lack of demand. Okay, so there is this economist, Christopher Wolfe, and he says if you have a factory that was set up to produce sour cream to sell to Mexican restaurants, you can't just decide that tomorrow you're going to produce ice cream and send it to the grocery store. That's just how restrictive these orders were. Tyson Foods temporarily ceases operation due to employees contracting COVID. And then you have farmers that are forced to slaughter animals because they don't have any place to sell their protein to. April 3rd, 2020, CDC recommends the use of face masks. Wow, just go back and take a look at it. It took from January to April, 14 April 2020. All 50 states are now reporting deaths. The first death was 8th of February, and here we are in April in every state. So this thing is really moving through the population pretty fast. Now, 27 April, Tyson Foods chairman warns of meal shortages.
It's kind of crazy to think about that it took the CDC a couple months to even start recommending the use of face masks.
Yeah, it really is. And at first, they were saying, oh, no, that you don't need to wear them because they're really kind of useless because the virus particles are so small. Then we slowly move into this, well, maybe it probably really is good to wear a mask because it keeps you from touching your face after you go out. And that's pretty good, really. Actually, it's just kind of common sense. If you go out, you're probably going to touch things and be in contact with other people. And we normally touch our mouth a couple of 100 times a day, even without thinking about it. So the mask does help with that. But the ones that we're wearing now, the gaiters, they don't really do hardly anything. And even a surgical mask, if it's not an N95 mask, is not going to be able to keep out that 20 micron virus particle from getting in there. They're just so incredibly small. Like I said, 100 million of them could sit on the head of a pin.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy. And you were talking about the chairman of Tyson warning of meal shortages. I remember it in the grocery stores. They were starting to run out of, especially meats. And that's kind of what we're going to get into later
absolutely.
on in this episode.
We were going in there and finding shortage, and it was somewhat intermittently. Go in, there wouldn't be any chicken, there wouldn't be any pork, there wouldn't be any beef. Eggs, there was a huge run on eggs. It was just, you had to get in the store early in the morning to be able to find some eggs. And then you have other things like canned goods that are flying off the shelf as well.
Yeah, and then that kind of leads us into the next thing we're going to talk about, which is the Defense Production Act. So the Defense Production Act was actually enacted on the 8th of September 1950 in response to the Korean War breaking out. And it was part of a broad civil defense and war mobilization effort later on in the context of the Cold War as well. And the implementing regulations are called the Defense Priorities and Allocation System, DPAS. And this thing's got three major provisions within the act itself. So the first one, it authorizes the president to require businesses to accept and prioritize contracts for materials deemed necessary for national defense, regardless of a loss incurred on the business. That's crazy.
Ouch.
And it also allows the president to designate materials to be prohibited from hoarding or price gouging.
That makes me laugh. Because, people, that's the first thing they do is go hoard the toilet paper, bread, water, anything else, canned goods, just random stuff that people go out and get. And then you think about just after hurricanes, if there's a gas station that's left open that still has gas, they're going to shoot that price up. Those are the kinds of things that just morally, it's wrong, but it happens. And some of these little small grocers, they'll go, okay, the hurricane's coming and I'll take my bread and I'll price it up another 10, 15, 20 cents. It may not be much, but you won't even notice it because you just went in there to get what you need.
They do it every time there's a national emergency, or especially hurricanes. I know the gas companies are the biggest offenders after hurricanes. All right, let's look at the second thing this Defense Production Act authorizes. It gives the president the ability to establish mechanisms to allocate materials, services, and facilities to promote national defense. And that seems, national defense in this case seems kind of vague, because I feel like that could pretty much mean anything.
Yeah, but I think there is, if you read down a little bit lower in the sub-paraphrases of these three titles, there's something in there that talks about emergency preparedness being part of national defense. And that came in under the John McCain National Emergency Act that was enacted in 2017 or 2018, somewhere around there.
All right, and let's look at the last, pillar of this Defense Production Act. So it authorizes the president to control the civilian economy so that scarce and critical materials necessary to the national defense effort are available for defense needs. So that, to me, that sounds kind of vague. It pretty much sounds like the president can basically dictate sectors of the economy.
Just whatever the heck we need. If that's what we're going to talk about here, is the meat industry. Now, I can think of a recent use was back in the time of Obama's administration around 2011. He used the Defense Production Act to force telecommunications companies under criminal penalties to provide detailed information to the Commerce Department Security Division on the use of foreign manufactured hardware and software as part of efforts to combat Chinese espionage. That's a lot. That was a mouthful I just said. But really, I do remember that. I had just not long after that started working at the Defense Logistics Agency, and they buy just about everything for the U.S. military except for bullets. And it was a big thing there when we were looking at all the components that were being used on the computers that were coming in, that we were purchasing from manufacturers in the United States. What you find is once you get to that manufacturer and you start looking at the parts and pieces that they use to put it together, yes, it's being manufactured in the United States. What it's being done is actually being put together in the United States, and some of the parts and pieces are coming from around the globe.
Yeah, just like cars, they're like assembled in the U.S., but all the individual components are manufactured somewhere else.
Yeah.
Just like all these Huawei cell phone chips and stuff. I think over the last couple of years, people have talked about the chipsets having like secret back doors so they could spy, or where there was the threat of something like that happening.
Yeah. And we're scared of that because we literally do that to other governments too. So,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So you got the COVID-19, and President Trump around 20 March invoked the DPA, that's the Defense Production Act, to require GM to accept and prioritize contracts for as many ventilators as they could. That's telling GM, hey, you got to stop everything that you're doing and everything that you're making and start making ventilators for us.
Yeah, I think I remember that in the news as being a big deal. Something about, I think GM was complaining about that was going to cost them a bunch of money. But, I mean, the administration pretty much did it anyway. And I think if I'm not mistaken, the administration designated that to the Health and Human Services Secretary, Azar.
Yes, absolutely. Sure did.
These companies like, hey, I need X number of ventilators. Here's the contract. Go.
Yes. And they pretty much are going to get the money back because they do just hand them a contract and some money. And if they need more money, they give them more money. Yeah, we needed the product and they get it. They get it to us.
Really good at spending money.
Yeah. So on the 2nd of April, President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to require 3M, General Electric, and Medtronic to increase the production of protective masks and ventilators. Pretty important date right there.
Yeah, that was kind of a big one. And that was the day before the CDC recommended the use of face masks.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that was April 3rd.
Pretty crazy date, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they knew they were already talking about it. So now on the 28th of April, you have President Trump using the Defense Production Act to mandate that plants producing beef, pork, poultry, and eggs stay open. That order gave the USDA just extraordinary powers to have firms maintain production. However, the order did not allow companies to ignore safety rules. Okay, so now in September of 2020, OSHA fined Smithfield and JBS for failing to take the necessary action to prevent the spread of COVID in their facilities. That's pretty big because Smithfield is the largest manufacturer of pork in the United States.
And probably the world.
Probably the world, actually. And we're going to get into some big stats about these companies a little bit later. Smithfield and JBS are part of the big four.
Yeah, and I actually remember reading an article about a facility in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I forget what they were producing, pork, beef, whatever it was. But there was like 700 cases of COVID coming out of that facility. But it was a big one, so they couldn't really afford to stop producing because then that was going to leave shelves in the grocery store dry. So they really had to maintain production, even though they were having these kind of ridiculous numbers of cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about a ProPublica news article that was written and talks about how many numbers of people were actually sick from COVID in all of these production plants. Well, 15 of the large production plants. Okay, so just in case you don't know what OSHA stands for, it is the Occupational Safety and Health Agency.
Yeah, they're the ones that make all the crazy rules about safety in the workplace.
Yeah, if you got those electric tow motors, it's got to be set up in a certain way in a corner, and if you need to have masks and gloves for something, they've got to be set up in a certain way. And if your medical equipment, your first aid equipment's got to be in a certain location.
Yeah, but it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, it's all really good stuff. It's really common sense, good stuff. And these fines that they hit these companies with are rather significant. It hurts their pocket.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about the meat industry just a little bit here. Now, between March 31st and April 27th, you had over 20 meat processing facilities closed. Now, these are the places where they turn all your meat into beef, roast, steaks, the kind of things that you find in the store. Now, because these plants closed, there was about a 30% reduction in production capacity of these items in the United States. And this is where you start to see the shelves in the store start to go empty, and there's a slinky sort of effect there. Now, on 28 April, John Tyson took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Arkansas Democratic Gazette, writing that, and I quote, "The food supply chain is breaking. Meat supplies will be limited. Millions of livestock will be euthanized."
Now that's crazy. First of all, I wonder how much those ads cost, because I'm pretty sure a full-page ad in the New York Times or the Post has got to be at least like $100,000.
Yeah, this guy's pretty rich, though. You think about it. He's Tyson's Food. He's the director of the board, so.
And his name is on every single product that they.
Yeah, and it's if you go back and you look at the company, it's pretty interesting. They're 3 generations into this now. Mm-hmm. And that's huge. They're huge.
We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but they're actually one of the 4 biggest producers of meat, and they're one of the 4 that actually happens to be American-owned.
Yeah.
But we're going to get into that in a little.
So this date, 28 April, is pretty significant. He takes out this ad. That's the same date Trump, 28 April, invokes the Defense Production Act to mandate plants to produce beef, pork, and poultry and eggs, no matter what.
Yeah, so the same day he's taking out ads saying the world is ending, you're not going to have any more meat, that's the same day they're saying, oh, just kidding, you're going to stay open and make more.
Yes. We're a free country.
And it's crazy that they were talking about euthanizing millions of animals.
Yeah. What you have is that these animals are basically raised to a standard size and weight so that when they go to the production facility, they can fit the machinery that's at these production facilities. It just streamlines the whole thing. But in this situation, when those processing plants close down, these are large farms that are raising hogs. They have no place for these hogs to go and be slaughtered at. There's just not enough small butchers in the local cities to be able to do this. And most of those small butcher plants are booked way out because they got people bringing deer and they bring in their own cattle in there, 3 or 4 head of cattle that they might have. And there's just not enough of them out there to keep up with this production.
Yeah. For example, let's talk about some of these crazy stats that I have written down here. Smithfield Foods, which happens to be the largest pig and pork producer in the world, in their Tar Heel, North Carolina facility, they process 32,000 pigs a day. That's what we were talking about. These local businesses can't compete with that. 32,000 pigs a day.
They're just huge. Just don't really think about how many are out there.
Yeah, they own over 500 farms, and then they contract with another 2,000 plus independent farms. And oh, by the way, they're actually owned by the WH Group, which is a Chinese company. So they're really not even an American-owned company.
Not anymore.
No.
Not anymore. They started off as an American success story, too.
Yep.
Now you've got another foreign company coming in and buying up a piece of America and farmland in America.
Yeah, and Tyson, one of the few, the proud, the American companies. Here's some cool stats about them. They're responsible for 20% of the beef, pork, and chicken in the U.S. They process about 155,000 head of beef per week, 45 million chickens per week.
We had actually, just after you had read that stat, we kind of looked at what's going on in the world and looked it up. There's, 27 billion chickens? Or 25 billion?
25, 26, 27 billion chickens in the world. Something ridiculous like that.
Yeah, it's like every person in the world eats 2 to 3 eggs every single day, whether they like eggs or not, because eggs can be reproduced in just so many different things.
Mm-hmm. So I got a couple more stats for you. 45 million chickens per week. Then they also do 461,000 head of pig per week. And they also own a couple other companies. I mean, they're the big company. They own some subsidiaries like Jimmy Dean, Hillshire Farms, Ballpark, and then several others.
And those are huge American brands. When you go in there, you don't think Tyson owns that. That's Jimmy Dean brand.
All right, so we've already talked about 2 of the big 4 meat producers in the U.S., Smithfield and Tyson. There's 2 more, JBS and Cargill. So let's look at some of the crazy revenues that these companies have every year. JBS, $27.8 billion a year. Smithfield, $14 billion a year. Cargill, $114.7 billion a year.
Okay, that's a crazy number. So we went back and took a look at some things, and that's actually more than the GDP of the entire nation of Ukraine. And they rank about the 60th richest nation in the world out of 189 nations.
That's crazy. Then we also have Tyson's at $42.4 billion a year. Now, these four companies, they're making money hand over fist, but they're also the largest four producers of meat in the U.S. and possibly the world. I'm not entirely sure. Fun fact, two of the four aren't even American-owned primarily. JBS is actually a Brazilian-owned company, and then we already talked about Smithfield being Chinese-owned.
So one of the articles I've read, too, that says that these industries are so streamlined because they have to standardize the size of the animals and everything else, that these four companies actually comprise 75% of the processing business for over 60,000 hog farmers in the United States. That's pretty crazy. Now, there was a economic impact study that was done in 2016 that's very interesting. This was done by John Dunham and Associates. It says that the meat and poultry industry account for $1.02 trillion in economic output. Oh, that's like 5%, almost 6% of our GDP. The U.S. meat and poultry industry is also responsible for 5.4 million jobs, and that's at $257 billion in wages. Pretty crazy. That's
a lot. 5.4 million jobs and $257 billion in wages. That's a big slice of the economy.
So when you go back and think about Trump invoking this Government Production Act to force these people to stay open, you got people that are sick in there. They got families, and it's pretty sad. But, also those people that are working there, and most of these plants, they're in fairly small towns, close-knit communities. And if they go down, pretty much the town economy go down around there too. Mm-hmm. So, and there was another study that I read that says that American men eat about 4.8 ounces of meat a day. So that's about 5. I know I probably myself eat more than that. And that women eat an average of 3.13 ounces a day of meat. And so, and it's the same study too, it talks about that Americans spend less on meat and poultry than any other developed country in the world.
I guess we just have the process down a little better than anybody else.
Yeah, we do. And you go to these other countries, it does cost a lot more to get meat in Europe and Asia. A lot of countries in Asia are really dependent on U.S. beef being imported. Now, let's kind of look at the other side here. On June the 12th, ProPublica, it's a newspaper, they reported that there was an estimated 24,000 COVID cases with meat packing facilities and 87 deaths. They also reported that they somehow obtained several thousand emails from Tyson, and they reported that Tyson wasn't exactly forthcoming with small town public health officials.
Well, I mean, prior to, I guess, the Defense Production Act being invoked and them being forced to stay open, they probably didn't really want to close because that would affect their bottom dollar.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
If they're going to these local public health officials that make those decisions, maybe it's a good idea to not be super forthcoming with the amount of cases in your facilities.
Okay, so let's look at how do we fix this situation. And this is Bob and Tom just mulling stuff back and forth. But I read this article, and this is something that was really cool. And it was in the Food Safety magazine, and there is this law firm, Bill Mueller and Dennis Stern, and they teach food safety litigation courses at the University of Arkansas School to other lawyers about once or twice a year. And at the end of the course that they teach, they have lawyers write a article about what they've learned, about what they gathered out of the course. And there was this one guy, Bill L. Ballard, that wrote an article that was just so good that they went ahead and published it. It's called We Don't Rent Pigs. And it really talks about this whole entire industry here. And then he goes in and he talks about some of the things that maybe could reduce the fact that we have these appearing to be monopolies in the meat industry. And in that, he talks about the Packers and Stockyards Act being used.
So what is the Packers and Stockyards Act? So it was actually enacted in 1921 and continuously amended through about the Reagan administration. There hasn't really been any major amendments to the act itself since around the time of Reagan. So what happened? So World War I happened, and the cost of living was rising. President Woodrow Wilson ordered the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to investigate the industry from the hoof to the table and determine whether there were any manipulations, controls, trusts, combinations, or any restraints out of harmony with the law of the land or with the public interest. So basically, he was looking for any kind of monopolization of any of these industries.
Now, this is a pretty crazy time right here because you do got the war going on. But if you go back a few years around the turn of the century, there was a book wrote called The Jungle. And in that book really stirred the nation to start looking at public health and safety in the meat industry. And a few years later, we have tons of regulations that were put in place to regulate the food, drug, and cosmetic industry. And it was a struggle for several years afterwards. But it's interesting to note, okay, during World War I, when we got into the war, Wilson's idea was total war. I mean, total, complete war. Mm-hmm. They suspended pretty much every right in the United States that you think you might have of speech. You could only say that the United States was a great, wonderful place and that we're going to win the war. We're in this war totally, and we want to buy bonds, and we want to tell you that you need to buy bonds. They were literally putting people in jail for saying anything negative about the government or the war. Sorry, it was an interesting fact there. I just read in one of the books I was reading.
No, I think I've read stuff like that as well. I mean, the propaganda machine was definitely going. But I guess it worked out in the end. So, Wilson orders the FTC to do an investigation. And what do they find? They find that packers are manipulating markets. They're restricting the flow of goods. They're controlling the prices of these meats. They're defrauding producers. And they're defrauding consumers of food. They're crushing competition.
Oh.
They even went as far as recommending governmental ownership of the stockyards in their facilities.
Oh, wow.
Now, that's wild to me.
Yeah, the last part's pretty crazy in it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a little bit kind of like communistic or whatever. But when you said they were crushing competition, it just seems like things repeat in history. Yep. Over and over again,
Over and over again. So, this investigation happens, and we get to the act. So, the purpose of the act is to regulate interstate and foreign commerce in livestock produce, dairy products, poultry products, and eggs, and for other purposes. To stop unfair and deceptive practices, giving undue preferences to persons or localities. Yeah, right. Apportioning supply among packers in restraint of commerce, manipulating prices, creating a monopoly, or conspiring to aid in unlawful acts. They also made the stockyards quasi-public utilities and required the yard officers, agents, and employees to register with the government.
That's a good thing.
These stockyards were forbidden from dealing in the livestock that they handled and required them to maintain accurate weights and measures and pay shippers promptly.
Yeah, they really need to just be like the middleman. It's where you go to buy your cattle. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's funny. We talk about stopping unfair and deceptive practices, giving undue preferences to persons or localities. Yeah, right. So basically, don't lobby anybody and don't try to beat out the competition. Yeah, I don't think that's working so well.
No.
But it does look like they made an attempt to enact law and try to make some provisions that would lead to fairness, I guess, in the market. So maybe if we look at this actual act, and maybe there's some revision we could do to kind of break up this 4-company monopoly that's kind of going on in the meat market. All right, so today the act scope has actually expanded to regulate the activity of livestock dealers, market agencies, live poultry dealers, swine contracts, as well as meat packers.
Now, you're probably thinking about farms and ranches that you've seen on TV, where there's a few cattle out there, and the rancher's on a horse, and his wife is in a blue bonnet with some kids running around and chickens out in the yard. Well, it's totally different than that. I mean, these farms are absolutely huge, and the business, the ranching business, the cattle business, actually any of these agricultural businesses are much more in depth than people actually think, because there's a huge amount of money at stake here. Now, in 1996, a group of cattle feeders brought a class action suit under the Packers and Stockyard Acts against Iowa beef packers for using captive supply agreements. You want, Thomas?
Yeah, so basically captive supply agreements are ones where the producers, the bigger companies, pretty much set the conditions for how the transaction is going to happen. So basically what we're talking about here in the meat industry is these processors, they actually own the animals that the farmers are raising. And in a lot of cases, they either own or work with companies that produce the feeds, the medications, everything else, because they want to very strictly control the end product. So basically, the farmer doesn't have any real recourse to do anything. He basically feeds the feed that he's provided, he raises these animals to a certain point, and then he has no other option other than to give them to the processor, because they're actually the property of these big companies. And what happens is they get market price. So they don't really have any say. And that's what we're talking about with this captive supply.
Not much market competition in there for them to say, okay, I can sell to this person at one price, or I can sell to this person at another price. Who's going to give me the best price? Well, you don't have you don't have a say, because these people own everything all the way down to the cattle. Now, it's I can see the company's point there, because it's about streamlining and efficiency, and then at the end getting a reasonable cost product out to the consumer. There's a lot more to it, but that's kind of what we're talking about. So anyway, let's get back to this. So in 2004, a jury delivered a verdict for the plaintiffs, right? So they find that there were Iowa Beef was in the wrong, and they need to pay damages of $1.2 billion to this group of cattle feeders.
So the little guy wins.
Yeah. It seems good.
But wait, there's more.
The verdict was then thrown out by the United States Court of Appeals in Pickett versus Tyson's Fresh Meats and Company in 2005. But this is crazy, because it found that the meat packer had a legitimate business reason to limit competition.
So they agree with these big companies, the processors.
Yeah.
So they have a legitimate reason to limit competition for whatever reason. I guess maybe it kind of goes back to that streamlining you were talking about.
Yeah.
That they're expecting a certain product to keep their business going.
Yeah, and you don't want, much competition out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you're talking about these size of packers and manufacturers and people that have over 75% of the business, we're getting to that point where we're looking at monopolies, I think.
So the Packers and Stockyard Act actually has kind of a law enforcement brand. It's called GIPSA, the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Administration. It's a branch of the United States Department of Agriculture. So in 2010, the GIPSA administrator at the time was J. Dudley Butler, and the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust was a Christine A. Varney. And they held a series of hearings on monopolies, market manipulation, and market concentrations in agriculture.
So they just went to, they're having these hearings and having people come in and give their opinion on what's going on. And so they're just trying to open up a dialogue there.
Yep. And so as a result of these meetings, on June 22nd, 2010, you have published a proposed rule that would have reduced the legal standard for anti-competitive practices.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to that limiting competition.
Mm-hmm. And it forbid unfair practices and undue advantages, even without harm to competition, and ensured producers had access to arbitration. And then it also sought to combat price fixing by prohibiting packers from selling to other packers and preventing multiple packers from using a single buyer. So some of the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of what I guess you could say unfair trade practices, this rule was trying to combat. Widely supported by the National Farmers Union and the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, but it was vehemently opposed by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association.
So this is the flip side. So you got the guys that are the farmers, that's those two other organizations, and now you're getting into the packers and the slaughter facilities here. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and then you also have the National Chicken Council that's opposing it.
Yeah, they're the same ones. They represent the chicken manufacturers, production facilities.
Yep, and then you also have this American Meat Institute, and they estimate that the rule is going to cost some of these bigger companies roughly $14 billion. So, if it's going to cost them money, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, when you got companies that are as big as some of the countries in the world, right? $114 billion. $14 billion, yes, that's a lot, but it's probably not a whole lot to them. But some of the other companies, it's close to what they make. And these guys are into our government pockets hugely, okay? And then they all have their loans with banks within the United States that if they default on those, it's going to cause some problems. So it's almost like you're getting back to this too big to fail thing.
Yep,
right?
Sure are. So we talked about all this stuff. So what happened? So on November 3rd of 2011, GIPSA announces that they're going to publish the final rule, but this final rule is not going to have this controversial price-fixing measure. And what happens 15 days later? Congress defunds the USDA's implementation of most of the rest of the rule. And then Assistant AG Varney and Administrator Butler both resign by the end of January the following year.
Great idea, but we ain't going to give you any money for it.
Yep. And then Congress continues defunding the rule in riders in 2013, 2014. And then you have an amendment to permanently repeal the GIPSA rule that they tried to stuff into the Agricultural Act of 2014. Luckily, that thing failed after a lot of opposition. But basically, every year in the budgets, Congress keeps slowly defunding the ability.
You're taking a look at, okay, how many of these congressmen their campaigns are funded by ConAgra, Tyson, some of these other huge companies out there. They're all pushing these guys to say, hey, we put a lot of money in your pocket here. I don't think this is a good thing. What about you? No, I don't know. Yeah, so then you've got this fight going on in Congress about who's going to do what. They probably are all getting together, in the evening after everything's said and done and going, okay, tomorrow you'll fight about this and I'll say this and then, it'll all look good. Let's go home. And it's just crazy.
Yeah, basically money talks in this situation. But from everything I've looked at in terms of the way this Packers and Stockyards Act and some of these other sub-organizations in the USDA work, it looks like there's a lot of potential there to kind of have a good starting point to maybe tweak some of the rules a little bit, institute some new rules to kind of open up better and more fair trade practices within the meat production community. What do you think?
So, I empathize somewhat with the large meat manufacturers, processors, and their efforts to streamline a system that's got a lot of moving parts to it. They're trying to reduce waste, rework, put in efficiencies so that the end product that the customer gets is high quality, and it's also going to ensure them a steady revenue stream. Now, the flip side of that is we have the small farmer out there that doesn't have any real competition. They don't really own their animals, so they can't go out and say, I want farmer B or farmer D to give me a certain price so I can get the best price, and there's competition in there. I mean, there's just really none of that at all. There's no place for them to go sell 1,000 head or 2,000 hogs. There's these small meat facilities that we have in local towns. They're just producing deer for a hunter or somebody that might have 3 or 4 cows or a pig or something like that. And they're pretty backed up most of the time. So I think that we need to take a look at this situation as a warning, right? In an emergency situation, what's going to happen if these 4 big manufacturers go down? And this is not something that just affects the meat industry. This is in the feed and seed industry. It's in the biotech industry. It's really in a lot of the industries that we have in the world today. They've centralized, right? So that's all I have.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up. So that's all we've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed our story about how COVID has affected the food industry and a little bit of our ranting. So stay tuned for our next episode. It's going to be filled with intrigue and mystery. A who's who, if you will. Until next time, historians.
You've been listening to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History with Bob and Tom.
That was radical!
The #1 audio production for people with nothing better to do.
That was amazing.
For more info, head over to healthwealthandhistory.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.